All right, we'll go ahead and get started as folks are continuing to join us. Hi, everyone. I am Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with T.C. Boyle and Susan Coll discussing Talk to Me. You can follow the link we'll put in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question this evening, we invite you to use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to move to questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen. And we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We are very grateful to our family of loyal customers who keep our business and our spirits afloat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this compelling new novel from best-selling and award winner author T.C. Boyle. Talk to Me is a lively, thought-provoking novel that asks us what it would be like if we could really talk to animals. T.C. Boyle has published 14 novels and 10 collections of short stories. He won the Faulkner Award in 1988 for his novel World's End and the Prix Médicis, étranger for the Tortilla Curtain in 1995, as well as the 2014 Henry David Thoreau Award for Excellence in Nature Writing. He is a distinguished professor of English at the University of Southern California and lives in Santa Barbara. He'll be joined in conversation with Susan Coll, the author of the novels The Stager, Beach Week, Acceptance, Rockville Pike, and CarlMarx.com. She is the president of the Faulkner Foundation and teaches an intensive year-long novel workshop at the Writers Center, and worked as the events and programs director at Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. Thank you for that, Susan. And on behalf of us now, please join me in welcoming T.C. Boyle and Susan Coll. Thank you both. Take it away.
Thank you, Julia. I am very happy to be here, to be back virtually anyway, and delighted to be here with T.C. Boyle, an author whose work I've admired for many years. Today is the publication day of Talk to Me, and I want to begin by just being sure everybody knows that this is a really delightful book. I was telling TC before the event that I read it very slowly over the last month because I didn't want it to end. I was really enjoying it. So you're going to want to read it, and we'll be careful not to give away any spoilers because it becomes very twisty as it goes. TC, this is at the center of the book, of course, not a spoiler to say it's about a chimp named Sam and kind of a love story and a university story. There's a lot of different levels of storytelling going on, but at the heart, it is the story of Sam. And this is a subject that you've visited before, TC. Can you talk about that? I think it appeared in your very first story collection.
Yeah, sure, Susan, and thank you for doing this. It's a joy to be with you. As I was saying off camera, I love Politics and Prose and have done many, many live gigs there over the years, and I wish I could be shaking it out with the crowd, but here we are. And I'm in Santa Barbara in my home. Today is publication day, as you've mentioned, and afterward, I intend to go out and party. So yes, you don't choose your themes when you begin as a writer. You don't know what you're interested in or who you are. But now this is my 29th book of fiction. And I look back and I can see how they are allied in many ways, primarily thematically. And one of the themes that I keep revolving is the one that is, I think, central to our existence. Who are we? Why are we here? What is this world? Why is it a mystery? Why don't we know everything? And so I like to write about our impact on the earth, environmentally, but also in terms of the other creatures. We are a creature. We try to deny, our religions try to deny that we are animals, but we are. How are we different from the other animals? How do we impact them? All these things I like to write about. And so, yes, when I was a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop in the 1970s, I discovered that we were doing experiments to teach apes our language, sign language. in order to assess how language is acquired and at what age in their species, but also in our species as well. I was fascinated by this because we'd always been told that the dividing line between us and the other animals, which allows us ethically to use them as we like, is language, the use of language. And so I wrote a little absurdist story called Descent of Man, which became the title of my first collection of stories. And it's set in a lab where a young woman is working with a very brilliant chimp named Conrad, a genius and a charismatic figure. She also happens to be living with a guy who's a little bit of a schlump in comparison to Conrad. So I did a really absurdist take on it in 12 pages. Now, all these years later, I've come back and written a novel that does certainly have its humorous moments. Sam, the ape in this, is a picaresque figure, really, but also, I think, should be deeply affecting. In fact, at the climax of this book, if you're not sobbing, I'll sob for you. Because this keyboard before me was wet with my tears.
Yeah, it's very sad. And yet, again, no spoilers here, but close to the end, you have a really joyful scene as well. I remember making a little note in the margins when he and Amy it's around Halloween time, and they're just doing something really lovely and celebratory on the dunes with the sun setting and drinking Cokes or whatever they do together. So you've really got both the kind of joy of life and the real dark side of these animal experiments, if you want to call it experiments. Is that the right word, would you say?
Yes. And again, we should set this up for people who are viewing. There are three principal characters. It begins with Amy. She is an undergrad, and like many undergrads, is looking for something in life and something to do. And it happens that one of the professors at the university has been chosen to cross-foster a chimp in a human household. This idea was that chimps don't even know that they're chimps. They're raised as human beings to see how they acquire language and to teach them to speak to us in American Sign Language. She became aware of this, and the professor who is running this experiment needed people to work. And, the grunt work, the cleaning the diapers, the cleaning the crap off the walls, etc. And so she went to his house. His name is Guy Schermerhorn. And she became integral to this whole project. And as things move on, she becomes very much a mother figure to Sam, who was an infant in the beginning. And also, as it progresses, almost a lover, although we don't quite go into interspecies sex, but a lover in the most deep sense, that is a bond, a spiritual bond with this animal.
Right. And you do give an interesting detail about interspecies sex and chimps. So if that gets you to go out and get the book, you will learn something about that. What happened to these experiments? These were more of the 70s and 80s, and then you suggest in the book that they became discredited.
I'm getting most of my information from these superb nonfiction books on this, like Nim Chimpsky, for instance, by Nancy Hess.
Great title.
Or I have right here, Roger Fouts' Next of Kin about Washoe. And there's so many superb books that detail what it is like for people to try to raise an ape as a human being in a human household. I think, as in the book, what happened was we went into this. Dolphins too, other animals, crows are very bright. We can communicate with them. I think we went into this thinking that the mystery at the heart of our existence, which is unfathomable to us, could possibly be revealed in some way if we could talk directly with another species. Some mystery of life might be revealed to us. But in fact, it didn't quite work out that way, because once Sam or Washoe or the real chimps here, Nim, were taught our language, yes, they could do, they're as intelligent as a 3.5-year-old child. which is pretty damn intelligent. Yes, they could converse with us. They could change subjects. They could bring up topics. They could discuss things beyond the concrete world. I mean, this is so very interesting. But once that's done, what's next? And so there was a reaction against this. I think some of these are still going on. I shouldn't say that it's over, but I think the initial enthusiasm waned and the sad part sets in. And the sad part is this. A chimp is far more powerful than a human being, physically powerful. And it's also a wild animal. We think of our dogs and cats. There have been thousands of generations in which we've bred dogs and cats to be domestic pets. And presumably, not always, I know a couple of dogs who don't fit this category who have been weeded out. These genes have been weeded out over the eons. But with the chimps, they're straight out of the jungle, or today, maybe second or third generation in a breeding facility. So this is a wild animal, a very intelligent wild animal that, like any person, child, doesn't want to sit at a desk and be taught repetitive tasks over and over, and wants to act out and have its own agency and volition. And so all the apes you see in movies and in these experiments are juveniles. Once they become adolescents, they are too dangerous, far too dangerous to associate with. And so what are you going to do with them? They live to be 50 years old. Well, they're caged. They're caged for the rest of their existence. And before recently, were used then in biomedical experiments.
And so one of the amazing things you do in this book as a novelist is you bring us into Sam's world. He's the main protagonist, and we get inside his head because you write from his point of view. I wonder how you did that. How much thought went into that? Did you have to make a lot of decisions about the extent of what Sam could understand? And then perhaps you could read us a little bit from that section, one of those sections.
Sure. Well, Susan, as my fellow novelist, you know that our job is to inhabit somebody else. And I have taken it as a challenge over all these hundreds of stories I've written, and this is my 18th novel now, to inhabit anybody from any walk of life, any age, either sex. And why not also try to give the point of view of another species altogether? That was what really fascinated me about this project. And these chapters from Sam's point of view are the ones in which I had the most fun, really. I'd like to give you a little excerpt from his point of view. And it happens, second chapter of the book, but you're projecting ahead to a time when he is removed from human habitation. So he's grown up like a human child in a human household, his every need catered to with love and constant 24/7 attention. But at some point, the heavy in this story, Dr. Moncrief, the guy who controls all the experiments and breeds the chimps, decides that he wants to shut it down. And when he does, Sam is sedated, and he wakes up not in California, where he was raised, in this house, the only place he knows among human beings, but in a chimp breeding facility in Iowa, where he has no idea where he is, and in fact, doesn't even know or recognize other members of his own species. And so, let me give you a little taste from Sam's point of view when this has happened to him. Key, lock, out. He didn't have a word for words, or not yet anyway, but he knew words all the same. He knew key, he knew lock, he knew out. He was a prisoner, though he didn't have a word for that either. And even if he did, it would have been meaningless. What did a word, any word, have to do with this situation, in this place, in the onrushing, unstoppable cataract of now, and the fear, afraid, that came with it? He had diarrhea, which existed as a pain in the gut, a stench, a hot, wet squirt of shit that needed no terminology and no afterthought. He wanted his blanket, a blanket, any blanket. He was cold. He was distraught. He rocked from side to side. He stared at nothing. He plucked the hairs from his arms, his chin, the crown of his head, trichotillomania. And he didn't know that term either. How could he? And what would it matter if he did? Would that get him out of here? Sleep was his only release, and it came to him in a blaze of shuffled images. The bathroom light so bright it was like the sun in the sky, a trickle of blood-warm water in the tub, and the face of the one who meant most to him, whose name he'd invented in the gesture of pinching his right nipple the way he pinched hers when she was with him in the bed. And they were both warm, and his shirt was on the floor. But then he woke. He always woke. For the screams and the reek of his own diarrhea and the food he refused and the din of flesh pounding on metal. When he was thirsty, thirst came as a sensation, pre-verbal, non-verbal, and he picked up his cup and drained it. He didn't think, drink, didn't sign, drink. He just drank. Until the cup was empty, that is, and no one came to fill it for him. Then the word was there, and the sign, the gesture, thumb to the lower lip, descriptor and request, both. And when no one listened, when the cup went unfilled and the box, the cage, the prison he measured over and over with the length and breadth of his body spoke despair to him, spoke rage. He screamed, he screamed, he screamed. In the morning, there was no morning at all because there were no windows in this place and the lights never dimmed or faltered. They came with food for him, food he didn't want, food he refused. And he compacted his own shit in his hands as best he could and flung it through the bars at them. They didn't like that. They backed away, cursing in their alien voices, and he held one hand under his chin and waggled his fingers, cursing back at them, dirty, dirty. That didn't help. Nothing helped. He worked at the bars with his hands and his feet too, but the bars were cold steel. The bars were immovable. And every time he looked beyond them, he saw more bars and barren walls and moving shadows till he shrank down inside himself. What had he done? Where was he? Where was his bedroom? Where was his house and his bed and his tree? Where was she? And why had she allowed them to bring him here? He took it as long as he could, huddled in the back of the cell, the box, the cage, and then leapt to his feet, clung to the bars and screamed again until the big man came through the door and every voice in the place fell silent. It was as if there had never been a voice except his, echoing down the corridors and reverberating off the bare walls. But of course, he didn't know that word either. The acoustic signifier, only the phenomenon it represented, the physical effect that involved eardrums and cochlea and neural pathways. The big man was coming, and he had the stinger in his hand, which was called a cow prod, though that formulation was beyond him too. Hurt, he knew that, and he knew cow. The big, lumbering, night-black creature that solidified the shadows in the scrub out back of her house, of his house, the place he used to be before this. But that didn't do him any good because the big man with one eye, with the black eye patch that was like a hole drilled in his head, rose and swelled and touched him with the stinger. And suddenly he was writhing on the cold cement floor beyond the reach of words now, except hurt, except afraid.
Yeah, that's so, those scenes are really painful to read. There's some real cruelty going on. You have another chimp in there who's known nothing but hardship. I'm trying to remember his name, but that story is
Azazel, and he's very angry, and he's in his 30s now. In doing the research for this, in these marvelous books I'm telling you about, chimps became very expensive and necessary in this era. They're $10,000 a piece way back then. So they tried to buy them. They bought some from circuses and so on, and they won. Some cowboys had him in Texas, and one of the guys had been on a trip to Africa, and here was this little infant that he bought, and he brought it back. What are you going to do with it? It's dangerous and powerful. So they just chained it to a stake. And, for fun, they would give it a beer and throw food at it and so on until finally it was purchased by the guy I call Moncrief to be part of his breeding facility.
Speaking of Moncrief, in a letter to readers that I read about this book, you say there always has to be a villain in a book. Is that the case? Is that
Well,
something I haven't properly understood?
I don't know if there always has to be, but in this case, yes, there is a villain in this one. Absolutely. Um, and you know, we haven't even talked about the human characters who predominate in the book. Amy and her professor, Guy, who she has a relationship with for some years. Guy also has great sympathy for Sam and his wards and so on, but he's also, like many professors, driven by the desire to rise in his profession. And in doing that, he tends to see Sam, as of course Moncrief does, and many, many others who dealt in real life who dealt with this, as a means to an end rather than as an individual or a creature worthy of our full empathy.
Yeah, and not to dwell on this too much, but I'm really curious what other research you did, or because this is so, it's so realistic that it feels as if you went and spent time in these facilities. Was it mostly through reading or?
Mostly through reading, but I do have a friend who's a primatologist, and she introduced me to one of her students who studies the chimps in their enclosure at the LA Zoo, and I went with her, and she indicated things to me that were very interesting. And I should say too that, if this gets too personal, but every night of my life, I sleep next to a grade 8 ape in my very bed.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes, her name is Mrs. Boyle.
I see.
Hey, so my friends are great apes.
Right. Well, this is a subject that's been fascinated other novelists as well. I remember the Karen J. Fowler.
Yes, absolutely. I have not read her book because I didn't want it to influence mine, although I like her work very much. There have been several, I believe, but I think it fascinates us as novelists because we live with words. We are made of words. Our life is words. And it's so fascinating to think how the consciousness of animals might be different from ours. Chimps are perfectly fine. They've evolved beautifully to live in their environment and to communicate. We use body language, but they are almost entirely body language, and it's very elaborate what they can communicate. Unfortunately, another great ape species came along and destroyed their habitat and put them in cages and made them learn American Sign Language.
Well, speaking of American Sign Language, and if this is too in the weeds, tell me, but did you come up against conversations about the difference between just teaching someone to sign in order to communicate a need or desire versus actual communication? That became a dinner table conversation in our household when I was telling everybody about your book.
I didn't really get into it here, Susan, but this book, I should say, those who know my work well, will go back to my novel, Talk from 2006. This is a novel about identity theft, and the woman whose identity is stolen is deaf. So I got to come to Gallaudet, for instance, and present the Tortilla Curtain to the student body and meet so many of the students. And to think about a consciousness and a brain that is wired differently from ours out of necessity, but is equal in every possible way. ASL is equal in every way to what we do and in our language. And the book is about that, exactly. And also language and identity. Who are you? How do you know who you are? So when Dana Halter's identity is stolen, it's even more meaningful for her than it would be for us because she has fought so hard for that identity. So yes, I was thinking very much of Talk when I wrote Talk to Me in terms of language and identity. Absolutely.
And I have a craft question for you, because the as we approach the end of this book, it just took such an unexpected turn, and you went into an unexpected point of view, and it was wonderful. And I wonder if you plan that out in advance, or if you just write and that's suddenly where you need to be in a different point of view.
Choice B.
Choice B.
Absolutely.
It just
happens. I'm just dreaming a dream, living a dream. Before I came on with you today, I've had a frustrating day of work on the next novel, which I'm 2/3 of the way through. And, around that point in any book is when you hit a wall, because you have put things in motion with great excitement. And now you have to understand what it is that you're doing, what it means, why you're doing it, where it's going. And it's often difficult. But so far, I've been able to slog through. I don't have any outline or anything like this. I'm just thinking about it, mainly on an unconscious level, most of the time that I'm awake, and maybe even when I'm asleep. You hope you're making the right choices, but really it's the way you make art. You try to address the world as you see it.
And you generally go back and forth between short story collections and novels. Is that right? Has that always been your
Yes.
pattern?
Yes, I began writing stories in college and then in grad school. And in grad school, I became friends with Ray Carver, who only wrote short stories. And I said to Ray, I'll be content just to write stories too. Also, one of my professors at that time was John Irving, who only wrote novels. And he said, well, you might change your mind. And he was right, because once I finished my PhD, I began my first novel, Water Music, which is about Mungo Park's explorations in Africa in 1795 through 1805. An enormous task of 100 stories cobbled together in one big story. And I realized that a story is a story, and that I am dedicated to both. But I still will always be dedicated to the story, so that, for instance, I think many of people listening here have seen my stories recently in various magazines, including the New Yorker most recently, and the new one coming in Esquire soon. This book is called I Walk Between the Raindrops, after the New Yorker story from the year before last. And it's 13 new stories, all various and all lots of fun. Once I write a novel, I feel wiped out. It's this parturition process that we all go through. But unlike other novelists who have to climb Mount Kilimanjaro 5 or 6 times, I can immediately turn to the stories that I want, because as you know, as a novelist, when you're writing a novel, you can't be distracted by other things. And so if you tell me something today, or some great idea comes to me, or something's happening in society, I can't really address it until I'm done with the novel. So there's a lot of pent up energy and ideas. An example of this is in the new book of stories for next year. Is a story called The 13th Day. That's the one that will be in Esquire soon. I wrote it in February of last year, when the pandemic wasn't a pandemic yet, and we didn't know what it would be. Now, I'd written about things like this before, and after the plague, for instance, and I was fascinated. And so I wrote a story about the cruise ships at that time, if you recall. There was an infection on the ship, and they could not find a port to go to. No one would admit them. So I wrote a story about this, and it's a lot of fun, I think. Of course, there are fatalities, but what can I do? And my agent said, no, we cannot publish this now, because people are dying, and it's just not that funny. Well, it's not funny anymore either. But I think we've put enough distance between that period of the pandemic and now that it can be released. So that's an example of something that I needed to write at the time, and was able to write it at the time, because I was not locked into a novel. I was writing stories. But in this particular unfortunate case, it had to be held back.
That's the one that's coming out in Esquire. Is that?
Yeah. Early next year. Yes.
Yeah. Have you had that issue come up before in your work, because you are writing such topical?
No, never before. but this is an extraordinary circumstance. And I do write, in the stories I write, often very topical things, sometimes in the novels too, but there are also many period novels I've written. And the novels, as you suggested earlier, they have a point of view and you have to stay true to it. So I can't read fiction much when I'm writing my own fiction, because novels, because I don't want another voice creeping in. I wrote a book called San Miguel about the islands. Like, you can't see them; they're over my right shoulder out there across the Santa Barbara Channel. It was the most difficult book I ever had to write. It derived from my research on When the Killing's Done, which is also about Santa Cruz Island out here and the removal of invasive species, one of my environmental novels. But I found these two stories about San Miguel. Amazing coincidence. Two women had lived there with their families as farmers and sheep herders in different periods, 1880s and 1930s. And their stories never came together. And there was no one else out there except these single families. And there was a fragmentary diary from one woman and a memoir from the other. And they wrote in a fascinating way about the isolation and what it was like. And so I put the two stories together, and I felt for the first time ever, I would write a full novel without irony, because this is the voice I was getting from these two women. And it was difficult for me because I'm such a wise guy. I'm sorry, I can't help it. I love to make jokes and be contemporary, but it was locked in its period. And I almost gave up about 80 pages in, but I'm so glad that I pursued it. And I'm very pleased in particular with that novel, because I think it succeeded.
I want to remind people to put any questions they have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. TC, you mentioned, as you were talking just now, about period pieces, and this, we should mention, is a period novel as well. It's set in the late 70s, early 80s. And there were a lot of charming, funny details that toward the end of the book, you have a very funny line, kind of wink at CNN, where you say a bunch of networks, CBS, NBC, list them all, and then CNN, the new one, nobody watched. So I wonder how you went about that research, reminding yourself what to include and what not to include.
I think I was just doing what comes naturally. When I wrote my book, The Inner Circle, about Alfred C. Kinsey in the 1950s, well, then I read texts about the period and absorbed it totally. But I have a recall of the 70s myself and didn't really have to delve that deeply. In the very first paragraph of the book, which is from Amy's point of view, she's a student in her apartment. She has suffering from anomie and doesn't really know what she wants to do in life and so on. Within a few lines, she's talking about a new Talking Heads song. And I think that is simply a way of locating the reader in its period. It's a new Talking Heads song. So when was that? And the reader thinks, well, maybe late 70s, I don't know. And there it is, It's not calculated, really. It just sort of happens when you're thinking about the period.
And of course, it's set in this period because that was when these experiments were at their height.
Yes.
You also begin by talking about this chimp whose name I had vaguely remembered and then looked up. I'm going to get the name wrong now. Fred J. Muggs.
Fred Muggs.
Yeah. Can you tell people?
Yeah. Okay, so he was a chimp on the Today Show when the Today Show first began. No one knew that we could have morning TV. Morning was for little children on their way to school. And so the initial Today Show, which, by the way, I do not remember, but I read about, began as a show that would be for both adults and children, because there's the mother and perhaps the father running around having breakfast, and there's the kid sitting there. So they had a mix. And in fact, stories would be read over the air, and there'd be puppets and so on. And there will also be news features as well, until it evolved into what it is now. And the show's ratings weren't doing well, so they brought in a chimp called J. Fred Muggs to to give some levity to the situation. And as in the book, which I derived from the real life of what happened, when he got to be an adolescent, he created havoc. He was smart enough to know that when the red light on the camera goes on, he can do anything he wants.
Yeah, the level of intelligence you describe is really remarkable. There's a scene where Sam is able to take apart a window with a screwdriver. I assume that's based on something you've read. That.
Oh yes, of course. Another thing that seems so unlikely, but I derived it from my research here, and it actually happened, is one of the chimp women who absconded with the chimp and lived with the chimp for some years, was a devout Catholic and felt that he had a soul and that he should be baptized. And she found a priest who agreed with her. And so the chimp was baptized. And when I had this happen to Sam in the book, my German translator, Dirk van Gunsteren, said to me, okay, this is incredible, how could this be? But in fact, it happens. And whether it did or not, I would have used it because it illustrates something about, thematically about the book, as do animals have souls? Do we have the right to put them in cages and teach them our language, force them to speak our language? How do we use them? What about the factories in which the pigs, which are as smart as a chimp or a 3.5-year-old child, are confined in cages and never see the sun and are butchered for our pleasure? Again, when we were farmers in the old days, for centuries and centuries, yes, there was the pig, and the pig had a piggy life, and he had a girlfriend and piglets, and rolled in the mud, and he didn't know probably that he would have to die. But one day he's conked on the head and he's gone. The way we do it today, for efficiency's sake, is just terribly, terribly cruel.
I didn't realize that part was based on a story, that really happened. A woman ran away with a chimp, and yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I was listening. I just caught a snippet of it this afternoon, but on Fresh Air, Mary Roach was talking about a book on animal intelligence and had a story about bears that could actually go into houses and, open the refrigerator and set the eggs out without breaking them. And
my favorite bear is one you've probably read about also. This is the bear who figures out, is the one they experiment on to see if he can open the ice chest. So the ice chest has locks on it. Well, of course, he could dismantle that. They put something good inside, and they just try to baffle him, but they never can. As the manufacturer wants to make something more and more bear secure.
Well, do you think you have any more chimp stories in you?
My subjects are various, so who knows? But I think probably for the time being, that's enough. I never say never. The new novel is called Blue Skies, and it is projecting from now into the near future with regard to climate change and epidemics and so on. The same material that I covered in the year 2000, A Friend of the Earth, which projects to 2026 and has people wearing masks and the tremendous climate dislocation and so on. And of course, invasive species and using animals, wild animals as pets and so on. So I'm revisiting some of that, but with what we now know to see what the near future might hold for us. And it's not a happy prospect, but of course, I make it into a comedy. A comedy, though, that should kind of make you churn inside a little bit. I think that, from the very beginning of my career, I loved what Flannery O'Connor does. That is, in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, she can give you a kind of sitcom of this family, and yet it can turn terribly grim on you, and does in the end. I think that to go from comedy to tragedy in the same work can be some ways more effective than having one or the other proceed throughout.
Are you setting out to write comedy? Do you see yourself as writing comedy, or is that just the natural result of the subjects that you're choosing?
I think it's a natural result, but I talked about San Miguel when I wrote a full novel that is straightforward realism and tragic and a drama. But I had also written many stories in this mode as well, like Chicxulub, which is so well known to so many people, and students read it all the time. So yes, I like to work in any mode possible and not to restrict them. But naturally, I think I'm more of a comedian. This is how I see life.
Well, we need that. Okay, we've got some good questions. The first one from Sandra. After your research and having written movingly about a chimp, do you have a position on experimenting on chimps and other primates? How about other animals?
Well, my position is the same as I think any civilized person holds today, which is that it's wrong and that there's no need to do it. We've had advances in stopping epidemics and figuring out how to make vaccines, which is very important to us right now, by using animal substitutes. But I think the entire scientific community has come of age, and we realize the cruelty that is involved, and we have minimalized it compared to what it was. And part of what you get, I think, from this book is that many people in the field were unconscious of it. So, for instance, I write briefly about the French vivisectionist in here, who horrifically, would dissect a live dog. You've got to have the dog live so you can see the functions, the internal functions, but was so casual about it, or unthinking, that since he prepared it and strapped it out, cut open, he just left it there overnight for the next day. It's a thing. It doesn't, the pain that it might experience or what it might think was so irrelevant. It was like kicking a stone across the street. So yeah, there's that element in this book too, which I think should deepen your response to what happens with Sam in this book.
We have a Tortilla Curtain question from Alan. Was there a specific historical or topical episode that led to writing that book?
I grew up in New York. I am a neophyte in California, though I've been here most of my life now. And when I got here, there was a controversy over Proposition 187. Should we deny illegals or any right, people who are in the country without proper papers, the right to go to school and participate in the community? And I was a little bit surprised by what the reaction of the native Californians at that time, which was to hell with them, basically. And I just wondered, well, how do I feel? And what does that mean? And of course, there is not simply a sociological approach to the book, but there is a biological context as well, an ecological context as to us as animals trying to make a living off of the earth. And what does that mean and how does it work out? So there was no specific incident, but certainly at that time, I wrote the book in 93 and published it in 95, 93 and 94 and published it in 95. This was a hot topic, particularly in California at that time.
Thanks. Dana asks, well, he says, I felt such despair when you read from that section, and I'm concerned about your promise that the reader will be bawling. I know your work and imagine there's also hope here, ?
I think the book will be fully satisfying. And I think that sometimes tragedy is fulfilling for us and cathartic, and I hope it will be in this particular book for you. By the way, I should say this, my daughter is also a writer and a filmmaker. And some years ago, on Father's Day at the Hammer Museum in LA, we presented a show. I read and she read, and she introduced me and I introduced her. And in her introduction of me, she said this: "I've only seen my father cry once. And it was when he was reading to us, her and her two brothers, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men." So keep that in mind.
Well, I'll add to that answer. If I were TC reading from my novel, I would say there's also some really beautiful, joyous, life-affirming passages, even as you're approaching a very sad end, that I found very affecting. So it's not all sad, even if ultimately the things don't go well for Sam.
Well, thank you, my dear. I should say too that I've never written a word without music playing in the background, and that I primarily love sad music, the Suicidal Cello Concerto, Mozart's Requiem. I just play on loop all day long when I'm writing, that sort of thing, for mood, a rhythm, but for joy also.
Yeah, you've got talking heads in here too, so it's not all sad. Paula says, "I'm curious if you have a present day metaphor or subtext in mind." Sorry, the question just moved. In mind in choosing to tell the story of the chimp at this particular moment.
No, I don't think so. Not especially. If anything, it's what we talked about earlier, my fascination with us as an animal species on this earth, but also my last book 2 years ago, Outside Looking In, is about human consciousness. This is about the beginnings of the LSD movement and the idea that we could expand our consciousness by ingesting certain substances, which leads to the whole question of God. I mean, so many people who trip say that it's a religious experience and that they see God. And so does that simply mean that God is a miswiring of the neurons or a stimulation of the neurons? What does that mean? So I wrote a book about these beginnings of the LSD era in order to investigate that. So that was dealing with human consciousness. So it seemed natural for me at the time to then go into the field of animal consciousness.
All right. Here's another good craft question. Hi, Dr. B. What advice would you give about making a main character who lacks empathy empathetic for the readers?
I don't think it matters. I don't think that should be part of the calculation. I never calculate such things. I've never written anything thinking, boy, this will sell. I just try to explore the world as an artist. That's what artists are supposed to do, I think. I think it's easiest for me to write male characters who are sort of bad boys in a way. I mean, it goes back to my story, Greasy Lake, which, is in all the anthologies, probably my most anthologized story about a bunch of punk kids wondering about what it is to be in the world. Guys like in Talk, which you mentioned earlier, the bad guy in this is also kind of a good guy in a lot of ways. Or Guy in this particular novel, Guy Schermerhorn, yeah, he's got a lot of good qualities and he is a feeling and good person. But on the other hand, we can see through it to his own sort of naked needs. It seems to me that the most difficult thing to do is to write a purely good character. I mean, Amy, I think, comes close in this book without making it seem artificial, because I don't think any of us, except me, of course, are purely good, Although I can think of some, and I don't want to mention any political names, who are purely evil, that's for sure.
Yeah, you have in this book a pretty clearly not empathetic villain, and that works quite well, but you don't really you don't have that problem in this book, and that you have Sam as completely empathetic, as is Amy. But that was another kind of delightful part of the period nature of this, because you had Guy, the professor, who sort of straddles being completely unlikable and slightly empathetic, has a lot of pre-Me Too characteristics that was kind of fun to be reminded of.
That era.
Well, fun is not the right word, but good to be
That
reminded
era.
of. Yeah.
One of the stories in my next collection is called Me Too.
Mhm.
And the first line is, "This was all a long time ago." And so it goes back to the period of the early 70s when sexual harassment was not yet talked about or known about.
Well, that sounds good.
It's a powerful one, as you'll see.
Here's another craft question that, well, I suspect you will have a different answer than most of us. How long does it take before you can render a judgment or evaluate your own work?
I've never published anything that I'm not entirely satisfied with. Yes, I obsess over it day by day. I rewrite every day, constantly, over and over, to try to move forward. And when I'm done, it's pretty much what you're going to see on the page. All writers are different. Some writers need to collaborate with their editors from the beginning. I've never done that. I just do what I'm going to do and rely on my instincts and hope for the best. Then my agent will be my first reader, Georges Borchardt, who's been my agent since I was in college, and then my editor, and then of course the copy editor after that. But essentially, I have to be confident in what I'm doing and have to be completely satisfied with it before I will let it go.
That's interesting. So you don't show it to your friends and family, you go straight to your...
Nobody, but I will say this, when I'm working on a longer piece and I've written a page or two that day, I would read it aloud to my wife, not so much for criticism, but to hear how it sounds aloud. Essential bottom line for me is the rhythm and beat of the sentence and the beauty of the language and how it sounds. And you can get that on the page, but it's another kind of brain function to perform it and read it aloud. So I love to do this. And some way, I don't know how this works. When I'm reading it to her, I see it more deeply and I can see where it's going and what it is. Whereas when I'm just writing it, maybe I don't see it in quite that way, because now I'm dramatizing it and I'm hearing the beat and rhythm of it.
Well, that reminds me that I know you're very big in Germany. I'm sure you're big all over the world, but Germany especially. And I wonder both why you think that is, but also, going back to the rhythm of the sentence and the way you really focus and labor on that. How does that work in translation? Or do you not? Maybe you don't know the answer.
I do know. And I've been very lucky with translators in many countries, but in Germany in particular. An added benefit is that most of my audience in Germany knows English very well, and at least half of them will buy the book in the original, which is quite extraordinary. When I'm asked about such a thing, I don't really know. I just say, I guess they have great taste in literature. What can I say?
Presumably you've been over there.
Many times. And I've had the same publisher almost from the very beginning, Hansa Verlag, and I have many close friends, and I've toured many times there. Back in the days when authors went on tours, Susan.
Yeah, soon. We're hopeful that by the time the paperback comes out, you will come to DC and we can have a proper hello and proper event. Well, this is
so
proper,
too.
but in person.
Yeah. Well, of course, there used to be, knights jousting, and there used to be glaciers and things like that, and cavemen and polar bears, and book tours, but not anymore.
Well, the good thing is we
Absolutely.
have people from all over the country here tonight, so that is a definite upside.
That's great. It is.
And we, of course, at Politics and Prose are so grateful for the two of you for tuning in to this event with us. Thank you so much, TC Boyle, Susan Coll, and our audience out there. We do have a bonus question from Politics and Prose, if you'll both indulge us. For our readers, besides hurrying to get their copy of Talk to Me, we always like to know what our authors are currently reading. What's on your bedside table, either fiction, nonfiction, other things you'd like to let our audience out there know about that you're diving into.
You want to go first, TC?
Sure. So I'm currently reading The Fate of Rome by Kyle Harper. I didn't know anything about the subject. The last time I investigated it, I think I was in high school. The barbarians really thrilled me, the fact that there were barbarians out there. Harper's take is that there were environmental and epidemiological factors that we didn't really take into account in earlier histories of Rome. So it's quite fascinating on that count. And as a side bonus, yes, I knew about the Ostrogoths and the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals, but there was a new group I'd never heard of before of barbarians, the Alans. The Alans, come on.
Susan, anything on your bedside table?
Yeah, well, as I was saying, I really savored Talk to Me. I left the last 20 pages till yesterday because I was really enjoying it and read it very slowly, deliberately. But at the top of my very large to-be-read pile, I have Zhang Yun's Oh Beautiful, which I have not begun yet, but tomorrow is the day. I loved her last novel, Shelter. And I can tell you that it is set in North Dakota during the oil boom, or present day oil boom. So I will get back to you, but I know it's going to be very good. So.
Well, we certainly look forward to your review. But before we all rush to get that, everyone should follow the link in the chat to get their copy of Talk to Me. More thanks to TC Boyle, Susan Coll, and our audience out there engaging with your thoughtful questions. Your patronage and support are so important to us in these times. We wouldn't be able to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. You can follow the link in the chat to get this book, or just head on over to politics-prose.com. Feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else we've got coming up while you're there. And from our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is staying safe, staying strong, and of course, staying well read. And we will see you next time. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much again, TC and Susan.
Thank you, Julia.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you.
And go celebrate, TC. Congratulations.
I will indeed. And I hope when I see you next time, we'll